Welcome to the Adorama Live Theater for this edition of Author Talks. I'm Peter Haskell, and our guest is Mary Jennings Hegar. Mary is a retired Air Force major who's written a book titled Shoot Like a Girl. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are a highly decorated helicopter pilot who was involved in dangerous rescue missions in Afghanistan. Just generally, describe what that's like.
Well, it was my dream to be able to fly in combat ever since I was a little kid, so it makes me a little bit nervous when people start thanking me for my service because I feel very selfish because I was just living my dream, you know, but I don't know, so it feels strange to say it was fun because obviously it's a very serious thing as well, but as an adrenaline junkie and a patriot, it was exactly where I wanted to be.
So you talk about your whole life. When did that first start? When did you think, this is for me?
I was probably 6 or 7 years old the first time I saw Star Wars and watched Han Solo navigate the asteroid field in the Millennium Falcon, and that was pretty much what did it for me.
You know, so much is involved in getting from that point.
Yeah.
And were there points along the way where you either thought to yourself, why am I doing this, or how do I get there?
You know, I mentor a lot of people. There's a lot of people who want to become a combat pilot, and it seems like such a lofty goal. So a lot of people come to me, and that's part of the reason I wrote this book or included those chapters, is because a lot of the questions that I get is, you know, how did you get there? So I always tell people, first of all, things are going to get rough, and even for the people who are the most dedicated, who have sacrificed and put their whole life forward to do this, there will be moments when you're like, what am I doing? I can't believe I'm doing this. So if you go into the journey unsure if it's what you want, you probably aren't going to, I don't want to say aren't going to make it, but you're going to quit. You know what I mean? Because even the most dedicated people almost do quit because it's that difficult. But I would say that you know, I faced those moments, and then I just tried to push through them, and the support of my friends and family was very critical for me. So
one of those moments might or might not have been a particular incident, 2009, outside of Kandahar. Your helicopter takes on fire. I'm just going to ask you to read this one paragraph,
Sure.
if you could.
Okay, so shrapnel peppered my right forearm and right thigh. The arm wounds were superficial. I couldn't see the leg wound, but the spreading blood stain was worrying. First, it was the size of a grapefruit. Then it grew larger and larger until it was the size of a basketball. But after a few minutes, the stain stopped spreading and I began to breathe easier. I'd never been shot before, but I'd flown so many wounded troops that I could tell a serious wound from a paper cut. No reason to call off the mission.
All right, so a couple of things. First of all, this is all unfolding. How do you process this?
To be honest with you, the first thought that I really had was that I was really glad it was me and not someone else, because the people that I was flying with, especially the guys in the back, because the aircraft commander sitting next to me, I'd only known him a couple weeks, but the guys in the back I'd flown with for years, and they were brothers of mine. So I was glad that it was me because I knew that I would, you know, I had a lot of combat experience at that point. I would handle myself appropriately, and it's actually most difficult. I think these types of situations are most difficult for the people who are sitting in the Tactical Operations Center listening to the whole thing unfold on the radio and unable to go out and help. So I was really happy that I was able to be, you know, there, and I knew that I could be counted on.
And you talked about the mission, so describe what the mission was and why it was important to stay and keep going forward.
We are a combat search and rescue platform. We were on loan to augment the Army for medevac. So combat search and rescue is a little different than medevac, but that's not really that important. So we were augmenting the medevac mission, which meant, you know, we flew out to a convoy who had hit an IED and had some injuries. We flew out and landed at the convoy to pick up the patients and get them to some medical help. So, you know, scrapping the mission and turning around and going home wasn't really an option.
Because if you do that, you leave your comrades in the field.
Right. Leave your comrades, leave the people who are injured. Another aircraft would have to come out, and, you know, then how would we feel if that aircraft came out and took fire and we lost, you know, people that we flew with because we terminated our mission. We were well within our rights to terminate the mission. We had taken fire. We had, you know, the co-pilot had taken fire. So some people in hindsight say that we should have terminated the mission. But I think, you know, we made the call, and if we made a mistake staying there, I'd rather live with that mistake than the mistake of turning around and going home too soon. So
you've been wounded. The aircraft has taken on fire. What happens now? What are the challenges that you face in trying to make sure you can save those guys and make sure you get out of there?
Well, we took a lot of damage in the landing zone when we picked up the patients. And if we had realized how much damage we had taken on, and also if we had realized the patients were urgent, but they were categorized, they were classified as urgent, but they probably weren't, there's urgent and then there's urgent, right? So they were classified as urgent, but they weren't like bleeding out, they were gonna die in 30 minutes or something like that, like often happened with a pickup. They probably could have been okay for a few hours. So if we had known how much damage we were taking, we probably would have just shut down there and endured the attack with the convoy, and that would have been a larger force to push back against the enemy fighters. But we thought we have urgent patients on board. We didn't realize we knew the damage was pretty bad, but we thought we could make it home. It wasn't until we took off and saw the fuel situation that we didn't have enough gas to get us home because the fuel lines had been hit. So we ended up in the worst possible situation, which was landing 2 miles away from the convoy without any security, without any perimeter, without any backup other than the aircraft that were in the area that were supporting the convoy.
So if I have this correctly, you've got another helicopter, a sister ship that is there, and so you need them.
Yes.
And what happens?
So we don't go anywhere single ship. We go everywhere two ship, and that is for self-SAR purposes, and SAR is search and rescue. So the point being, if one aircraft is disabled, the other one is there to pick you up. That is just our operating procedure. In their defense, before I say this, I'll say that it's very hot and you're flying very heavy. So it's hard to take on extra weight. But there are things you can do. You can dump fuel, you can kick equipment out to make yourself lighter. When we had our hard landing / light crash in enemy territory and started taking fire, our sister ship didn't land to pick us up. Now, some people would say, it's a good thing they didn't land to pick you up because then there could have been 2 aircraft on the ground. However, at the time, they had what we call a bent gun. So they had, a broken gun and couldn't really cover us that well. They only had 1 operating gun. And I don't know, it's hard to Monday morning quarterback things, especially in the fog of war. But like I said earlier, I would rather make the mistake of trying too hard than make the mistake of not trying hard enough.
But clearly your mindset was, these are my people, I can't just watch them from above, I need to get in there, I need to help them.
Yeah, and I, like I said, there's people on both schools of thought that think this way's right or that way's right, and if I'm wrong, I'm happy to be wrong in the school of thought of, sacrificing too much or putting myself at risk too much to try to save people. I'm happy with that. I think we're probably both wrong, and the right answer is probably somewhere in the middle. But at the time, when you're on the ground in a crashed aircraft with a sister ship who's supposed to land and take you for 20 minutes, and you're taking fire, and as time goes on, you're taking more fire, and then the Army birds that are there to support us who don't know us, they don't have a loyalty to us beyond the fact that we're both wearing the same uniform, they're the ones who actually landed next to us, and we jumped on their skids and went out that way. So
this is the superhero part of the story.
So somebody was able to land.
On the skid,
right.
So this is the superhero part, and what happens there?
Well, what's funny is we were part of the California Air National Guard, and in 2009, our boss was Arnold Schwarzenegger. So there were a lot of, get to the chopper kind of jokes. But yeah, it was like a movie. I mean, the Kiowas that are these little 2-seater aircraft, so they don't really have room for people to jump in and sit down. They landed next to us, and we had prearranged this on the radio. We ran out and jumped on the skid, which a skid is kind of like a snow ski underneath a helicopter. Some have wheels, some have skids. They have skids. The skids are attached to the aircraft with like a mount, and then the rocket pods are off of that mount. So, I had 1 foot on either side of the mount that had the skid attached to the fuselage. I had my back against the fuselage, my rifle braced on the rocket pod, and I was firing at the enemy there. So a lot of people think I was holding on like with my arm or on a rope ladder or something.
But still, it's got that kind of, you can imagine the cartoon image of this with you spraying gunfire. One of the themes of the book is a woman in a man's world. And so you've got this sister ship that doesn't want to land, and the pilot is a man.
Right.
What does that tell you about the ability or the role of gender in people being qualified for these types of situations?
Well, this isn't the only example, but it's the example I chose to put in the book because the other examples were very personal and were, you know, people I was medevacing who were having a really bad day and whose, you know, confidence I don't want to break. I feel a responsibility, like a doctor-patient privilege almost. But I saw a lot of examples of men I would bleed for and take a bullet for and have taken a bullet for, that I would go into combat tomorrow. And then I know that they would have my back. And men who I don't think should be going back into combat because I don't feel that they have what it takes. And then I've seen women who I would go into combat with tomorrow and women who don't have what it takes. So what that tells me is that it's not, everybody wants an easy way to classify and be able to pick who would do well in combat. And so gender is one of those easy things. Well, I'm just going to pick that person because he's a man. But that's not, unfortunately, it's not that easy. You know, you don't know who is going to respond well until the bullets actually start flying and you find out what you're made of. You know, I've seen 200-pound, you know, badass guys curled in the fetal position crying for mommy. And then I've seen, you know, 80-pound girls who are, you know, looking for an extra weapon to return fire to the enemy. You know what I mean? So it's just not about gender.
So from your experience, what is it?
I'm not sure. I had a journalist ask me a question that kind of gave me a little bit of a light bulb moment, who had read the book, and they said that there was a moment at the beginning of the book where I had felt very helpless as a child, watching my mom and my sister be physically abused by my biological father, and that I was sitting there crying and thinking, you know, I'm never going to be in this position again. I don't want to be weak and scared and unable to rescue the people who I love. And then, you know, maybe something about that experience is what kind of planted the seed of my warrior spirit later, that became my life's goal and my mission, and that kind of took over my heart, that I was going to, you know, protect people and, you know, be there for people who needed somebody to help them.
One of the things I thought was interesting, there were people that you wrote about that you thought you could trust, and it turns out you couldn't. And there were people you weren't sure about, and you found that you could trust them. What did you learn from that? And how do you finally determine these are the good guys, these are the bad guys?
I think you could probably say that for just about anybody, you know, that you go through life experiencing, thinking you can trust someone, and then they turn on you. I was just talking to somebody today about how people still really surprise me. People who I thought that I knew really well, and they surprised me on both sides. This person, you know, stands up for me when I thought that they would have shriveled under the scrutiny, whereas this person who I thought would have been my staunchest supporter is quiet and silently sending me messages of support instead of publicly, you know, that type of thing. So I think that the lesson there is, I'm kind of glad that I'm still surprised by people.
But it seems like it's a particular challenge when you're in the military and you're trying to move your way up and you're a woman in a man's game, at least for now, that's the way it is. Does that pose greater challenges?
I think so, especially when you're in a career field that's life or death. I would say, you know, in my experience, the men that are in combat jobs, it's assumed that they are going to do their job, and if they let you down, then that individual let you down. The women who are in those combat jobs, for the most part, there's a hope that they're going to do well, and if one of them lets you down, then women have let you down. I mean, it's a subtle differentiation, but it's almost like, you know, there's a scene in the book where one of my patients is a woman and she starts getting a little hysterical. And my gunner turns to me, not to the group, but to me because I was sitting next to him, and says, you know, this is why they shouldn't let women on those convoys. And not her, this is why they shouldn't have let her, but that's why they shouldn't let women basically into combat. And I'm sitting in front of him covered in blood and gas and, you know, aviation fuel. And I was like, are you kidding me? And he said, oh, well, no, not you. And that was my experience, was I was always thought of as the exception, not a representation of what women could do. Now, I think that that's changing. I mean, that was, you know, 8 years ago, and I think we've made some strides, and every day we get a little closer to, you know, not making judgments on people based on the color of their skin or their gender or whatever. Every day we progress a little bit more. Well, sometimes we take steps back, but in general.
It happens in life,
in
right?
general. You know, so I just, I think that you have to depend on yourself and be as competent as you can and put blinders on to the things that are happening around you and be the best at your job that you can.
One of the things, a couple of times in the book, I know you mentioned that some of the people who seem not to think that you were the right person because of your gender, you know, was an older person, was someone who didn't work hand in hand with you. Is it fair to be able to generalize that, or was that not the case? What was your experience with that?
Well, I try to be careful in not doing to people what I'm accusing people of doing to me, and not generalizing and seeing, you know, a certain demographic and expecting that person to be against me. Even though, you know, I would say 90% of the people who have opposed what I'm trying to do and have been very vocal about it, or even aggressive and threatening, have been from, you know, a very similar demographic. So I'm a little bit wary when I approach, or I'm approached by people in this older
demographic. You're saying older.
Yes, this older, you know, sometimes military, sometimes not demographic. You know, and I think that it's not because there's something lacking morally or ethically or character-wise with obviously one of the greatest generations that this country has seen and the wonderful things that they've done, but they had a different experience with women. That's what I always assume. When I'm being threatened or someone's being aggressive toward me, I'm actually usually very understanding. I very rarely get defensive and have to, you know, push back too hard, because I immediately think, well, you know, this person has had a different experience. The women that they've had in their lives, their mother, their sister, their wife, they don't feel like those people would do well in combat, and it's very possible they wouldn't. Or they haven't fought with women in combat. A lot of the people who are our supporters have actually fought with women in combat. And they say, I get messages all the time from Marines and Special Forces that say, you know, you keep up the great work. Some of the best Marines I've fought with were women, and that type of thing. So I just think it's a different experience, and it was a different time, and you know, it's pretty easy for me to overlook because of that.
How common was it to encounter discrimination and sexism? Very
rare. It actually was very rare. There's a lot of examples in the book because they inform the narrative, and they're important to point out. And it wouldn't make for a great book if I pointed out every single, you know, moment and interaction of support, you know. So it was very rare, but unfortunately what was common was people turning a blind eye to it, people staying silent, people not standing up and saying, hey, you can't talk to her like that. You know, somebody would approach me in front of a bunch of people and say something, you know, like, I don't want to fly with you because you're a woman. And I would be defending myself to that person, but I would turn and look, and people were starting to turn away and start playing Xbox and start having side conversations and being uncomfortable, instead of turning and saying, hey man, you know, why would you say that? You're this, you know, you're 60 pounds overweight and you can't run 100 yards with a pack, and she's an expert marksman and has been studying the language and knows the lay of the land. I want her on my crew if we get shot down, you know.
Does that hurt the teamwork and the camaraderie when these people do not stand up for you?
It does. You know, I ended up leaving my first unit and going to the California unit because of that, honestly. Because I wasn't facing a lot of discrimination. It's actually a great group of men and women in that unit. But I think there was a distinct lack of stepping up and doing what was right. And partly that was because there were the people who were in opposition to women in combat and women being on the crew, they were very intimidating, and they were higher ranking, and it was not easy to stand up to them. So in their defense, I can understand. I mean, as someone who's standing up now for what I think is right and facing a lot of scrutiny and threats, I can understand it being, you know, not comfortable to stand up and say what's right. But if more of us do it, it becomes easier and easier and easier. And the people who should be afraid to speak are the ones who are about to say something hateful and discriminatory.
You know, it's interesting because a number of times in the book you talk about facing a situation when you felt you were being wronged. And sometimes you chose to stand up and say, no, I'm going to put my mouth, I'm going to tell a superior. And other times you didn't. How?
Right. Yes.
How did you decide, and how difficult was it to say, this is not the right time, or I need to say something?
I think that because that's a question I get a lot from the people that I mentor. They say, well, I'm facing this at work, or I'm facing this, and when can I do something about it? And I always say that if it was obscenely wrong and I couldn't keep my mouth shut and I had to stand up and say something, especially if somebody else was being targeted right in front of me, then I'm going to say something. But if it was against me, I would go through kind of a mental checklist in my mind. I would say, okay, unless it's blatant discrimination, which looks like you're a woman, I don't want you to fly with me. That was pretty clearly,
Which
I can go from A to B, that's discrimination.
You heard that.
Yes, I heard that from one person. But there were other people who had a problem with me that I later found out it was because I was a woman, but I didn't accept that at first. And I think that's important, and I think that's the way you should approach this. So, number one, I would say, okay, what am I doing that's wrong? What am I doing that's making this person feel like I'm not competent? And let me fix that. Which, that attitude is why I became, and every pilot will tell you this, because it's a requirement of a pilot to have an ego about your flying skills. But that attitude made me become a better pilot and a great pilot, I think. And that was kind of my, thumbing my nose at the people who were trying to stop me, was because everyone who tried to stop me ended up making me that much better. So I would go through in my mind, am I doing anything wrong? Let me get better at my job. Let me figure out what's going on. Let me approach the person and find out what it is that they have a problem with. What did I do to make them, have this opinion of me? And if I go through like all of those things and I can't think of any other reason, then I would entertain the idea that it might be discrimination.
You describe an incident in the book where you were sexually assaulted by a military doctor, and you decided not to press charges. Do you regret that?
I do regret it. I wonder if I had pressed charges, how that would have affected my career. And that's just the reality. I'd love to sit here and say, and be kind of holier than thou and just say, absolutely. But I really enjoyed my career, and I really enjoyed being a pilot, and there's a chance it could have ruined my career. Now, granted, suing the Secretary of Defense isn't great for your career either. But I was a lot younger back then.
But do you think there might have been other victims after you?
At the time, and this is important, as a pilot, we go back and we review our actions, and you have to say that was the decision I made at the time with that information. With that, the information that I had at the time when I decided not to press charges was a full bird colonel, that's a step below a general, right? And the highest ranking medical officer on the base, looking me in the eye and telling me that he would ensure this person was never in a position to victimize someone again. The thing I regret is trusting that person and understanding that he was saying whatever he needed to say to get me not to press charges. So that's an example of someone who let me down, So yes, I regret that. I do think I should have pressed charges. I think that I deal with a little bit of survivor's guilt or whatever over not doing that, and I think a lot of women who are victims of sexual assault feel that way, that they should have done more, or should have, they're embarrassed that they weren't able to testify or something like that.
You talked about the suit, which was critical, and the idea was to allow women to be ground forces, combat ground forces.
Yes, yes.
Why was it so important for you to do that? I know you've touched upon it, but beyond what you said, why did you say, I'm putting my name on this?
Yeah, a lot of people think it was me against the Department of Defense, me against the Pentagon, and it absolutely wasn't like that. First of all, the lawsuit, it did provide some pressure to repeal the policy, but it was one of 2 lawsuits, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had unanimously recommended to the Secretary of Defense that he repeal the policy. The fact that I was taking part in the lawsuit, the Joint Chiefs of Staff providing their recommendation, we all were doing the same thing. We were all trying to do what was best for military effectiveness. It is a happy secondary issue that it was also the right thing to do, and it's a women's rights issue, and it affects careers and that type of thing. But really the primary thing is that it affected military effectiveness. It was tying the hands of the commanders in the field. They needed women in these roles, either because that woman happened to be, the best at her job or the best marksman or whatever, or they were going into a village that had a lot of women that needed to be pat down and men aren't allowed to do that, or whatever the reason was, women were needed in those roles. So commanders were being put in the position where they had to attach women to these units instead of assign them, which means they rotate out every 45 days, which means you don't train with them. As a man, you don't train with them, you don't get to know them, you don't get to trust them, you don't get to know their strengths and weaknesses, you don't form a bond. So the people who say that it hurt unit cohesion, well, yeah, but throw a bunch of men that they don't know in and it's going to do the same thing. So it was not an anti-military thing, it was a pro-military effectiveness. I'm on the same page as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're all trying to provide the Secretary of Defense the most, the most information and excuse to repeal the policy, to defend his action in repealing the policy.
We're running out of time. There's something in the news I want to ask you about. The Marine Corps, there are photos, explicit nude photos of Marine officers and Marines. What are you looking for to see what happens here, to see if this is being taken seriously, and to see that this kind of thing doesn't keep happening?
You know, somebody mentioned to me that this is an example of why women shouldn't be in these roles. And I say this is the perfect example of why women should be in these roles. Admiral Mullen said, I believe it was Admiral Mullen that said that as long as we have separate classes and we have, you know, jobs that women can't apply to, we create a warrior class and a support class, and it creates this dynamic of entitlement. When we have all the jobs open to everyone, then it's not like that. The thing that gives me great optimism is that, and I'm going to read if that's okay,
sure.
The Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, Ronald Green, who is the, I believe if they do it the way the Air Force does it, that means that he is the highest ranking enlisted member in the Marine Corps. He says, the statement that he released says, "Stand up, speak out, and be a voice of change for the better. Hold those who misstep accountable. We need to realize that silence is consent. Do not be silent. It is your duty to protect one another, not just for the Marine Corps, but for humanity." So that's my hope, is that people hear that guidance and they take it to heart.
Are you concerned that this is so ingrained in the Marine Corps that it's not going to be that easy?
Of course it won't be easy, but it wasn't easy to integrate racially either, and it was the right thing to do, and it was the best thing for military effectiveness. So we'll get there one day. The only question is, how difficult are people going to make it? How much damage are they going to do to camaraderie and to the unit cohesion and to the military struggling against this inevitable progress?
All right, I apologize. My last question is, shoot like a girl.
Okay.
Which sounds like it's derisive, but it turns out
It
it's
does.
not. Explain that.
Right. You know, women are, I don't love talking in stereotypes, but if we're going to engage in stereotypes, which some people want to, women are physiologically predisposed to being better marksmen. The Russians used a lot of women as their snipers in World War II. Women, it's something about our respiration and our circulatory system and our center of gravity, and there's some psychological aspects too, that women just tend to be better marksmen.
So it's the ultimate compliment.
It is.
Shoot like a girl. Guns, maybe not basketball, but others would disagree with that as well, right?
Yeah, maybe.
Exactly.
Right?
The book is Shoot Like a Girl. Mary Jennings, Hegar, we appreciate your time here today.
Thank you, thank you.
This is Author Talks. I'm Peter Haskell. Thanks for joining us.